All right, so Stephen is the General Manager of Transportation Services at the City of Toronto. Some interesting facts, looking after $10 billion in transportation infrastructure, so quite a bit. Prior to this, he was in Philadelphia, working as the director, is that over here? Oh, here we go. All right, so last week we heard about transportation and some of the things that are going on in Hamilton. Hamilton, as we know, is a much smaller city than Toronto. So when you're talking about issues in Hamilton, first off, we don't really have congestion issues. I think, well, in Toronto, everything is going to be much, much larger. I think that's what we're going to hear about today from Stephen. So I think we'll just...
Well, thank you. Again, my apologies for being late. I left about 3:15, so it took me almost 2 hours to get down here. And most of the general format, I have a presentation here. I'll go through it rather quickly, and I'm not sure sort of how folks like doing things. I tend to be a little bit better of a Q&A guy, but I'll go through sort of an overview of our department, highlight some different things we're working on. I'll go rather quickly, and then on the back end of it, we can maybe just do some Q&A about sort of interesting things that you may see here. So once again, thanks for having me. My name's Steve Buckley. I'm the General Manager of Transportation Services in the City of Toronto. I'll talk a little bit about sort of an overview of our department, sort of a little bit of the travel trends in Toronto, our strategic agenda, which is sort of a 5-year work plan, and then basically what we're working on in the city as well. And then again, I'll try to keep most of it focused on the Q&A. So transportation services itself, again, we oversee about 5,600 kilometers of road, about 8,000 kilometers of sidewalk, bike lanes, bike trails, bridges, culverts, traffic signals, pedestrian crossings, signs, bus shelters, street furniture, a whole host of assets that have about a $20 billion replacement value and currently basically are spread throughout the city. One interesting thing is actually 27% of the city's land area is actually the public right-of-way. So that basically all falls under transportation services. And the key piece of that is that we do have a large portion of the real estate within the city. And that was always important from sort of a transportation and utilities standpoint, but more and more, particularly in the dense urban areas, we're seeing a greater pressure on the right-of-way for other demands as well. Our organization, we basically have a public realm unit who oversees our street furniture and our pedestrian projects. We have a traffic systems unit which oversees our transportation operations center, all of our traffic signals, and all of the hardware and guts and software that go behind that. We have an infrastructure management group that oversees cycling infrastructure, planning and programming of our infrastructure as well. And what else do they oversee? They oversee a lot of our environmental assessment projects within the city. And then the other piece of it is sort of the operational side. We have the city broken into 4 different districts, and they tend to align with the 6 municipalities that existed pre-amalgamation. And then within there, they do a whole host of issues. So they do everything from road and sidewalk operations and maintenance. They do traffic services, which is sort of the more localized impacts of traffic. So traffic studies, safety studies, things like that. Stop signs, parking regulations. We have a right-of-way unit, which again manages many things within the right-of-way. Private development within the right-of-way, encroachments, things like that, and they also all oversee all the snow operations for the city. So what we do, again, as I mentioned, soup to nuts, sort of all the traditional things that you consider when you think of a transportation organization, snow removal, street cleaning, permitting, but we also do a whole host of things that are probably a little different than the traditional sort of public works responsibilities that historically have been part of things like transportation organizations. So we oversee pedestrian projects, we oversee cycling infrastructure, we oversee the public realm, we oversee street furniture, we oversee graffiti, and we also have, as part of that, a street art program, which is pretty cool and innovative, and typically I let them do the creative thing. I'm an engineer by training, but they do some really cool stuff within the city. So a little bit about my background. Again, I'm a civil engineer, and I ended up going back, and as I was designing things, I was actually designing highways outside of DC, and I said, well, who decided this highway goes here? And I learned a little bit about planning, and I started taking planning courses in the evenings while I was earning my bread and butter doing civil design work, and then ultimately went back to planning school full-time and got a joint degree in a master's in science and transportation and a master's in city planning at the University of California, Berkeley. And basically I've been trying to combine those two worlds, and I jokingly call them plangineers now, which are sort of folks who can understand and talk the technical talk of the engineer world, but also sort of bring in sort of the longer term and more creative side and longer, bigger picture issues that planners tend to see. I jokingly say ours is a business with little thanks, and someday we hope to see headlines of things like this. Another week where everyone made it home safely and conveniently. Region's residents once again get to work, schools, and shopping without major disruptions. Unfortunately, we always end up on a newspaper when things go wrong. So we're sort of in a business that you rarely get sort of positive reinforcement. So you have to sort of thicken your skin if you want to get into transportation. And no one gives you thanks every day for the things we do. They just expect the systems to work. Travel in Toronto, if folks, how many here are familiar with Toronto? Okay, all right. I'll go quickly through this, but in terms of large cities, we're pretty much up there in terms of looking at alternative mode shares. So this is a pie, and I have another graphic which sort of shows this in comparison to other cities. But you can see our cycling is about the 2% range. For commuting mode share, we're a little over 53%, and we do have a large share of transit and walking trips to work. So this is commuter mode shares. Again, I'm from Philadelphia, so all my good data that I had was all US cities, but this sort of puts them in comparison. And Toronto doesn't have too many peers within Canada itself, but these are rank ordered from the sort of largest to the top 10 cities in terms of population and size. And as you can see, red is auto, orange is transit, yellow is walking, and green is bike. And in terms of comparisons to other major cities, Toronto is actually has a pretty good non-auto mode share that basically exceeds every city but New York City. So in terms of, at times I find folks in Toronto say, oh, why can't we be a world-class city and do kind of creative things that are sort of not necessarily dependent on the auto? Toronto does, and we do a pretty good job of it. Unfortunately, I think at times we start comparing Toronto to cities like here, San Francisco, Boston, Washington, and everyone thinks that they're sort of the cool, hip, nimble cities. But I jokingly say they're hamlets. They're often 600,000 to 800,000 people in comparison to Toronto, which is about 2.7, 2.8 million. And when you look at cities like San Francisco, Boston, and Washington, D.C., which do tend to have sort of higher non-auto mode shares, the comparison I draw is if you look at the old city of Toronto, within the old city of Toronto, again, very, very competitive, exceeding all of those cities in terms of non-auto mode shares. Our transportation system, again, this is basically a map of the city. You can see the reds are the arterials. We actually are unique in the sense we own 2 freeways within the city. Most municipalities do not own freeways, but as part of a deal that was cut in the 90s, I guess we uploaded the schools and they downloaded 2 freeways, so we actually own the Don Valley Parkway and the Gardner, which runs along the lakeshore. Transit in Toronto, I did a good bit of transit planning in sort of my past life. So I find part of our job is to make transit work better, and it's often something that's not really talked about too much. Everyone's talking about big, sexy, large transit projects, and I think there's so much more we can do in terms of improving surface transit. And what folks seem to forget is that about 60% of transit users each and every day take surface transit. So they're not on the subway systems, they're not on the regional railway. And so that's an important part where I think we really can, in the short term, make some good improvements that benefit a lot of users. I kind of put this schematically together in terms of showing the city's transit lines. In the downtown core, we have streetcar systems. We have the St. Clair line. The gray one across the middle there is going to be the Eglinton line. And then the blue and green and the yellow and the orange are sort of the subway systems that exist. That's sort of the schematic showing by thickness and ridership. And this is sort of an image from the sky, and if you sort of overlay sort of the downtown, that's sort of what it looks like. And I give this to folks for context in terms of showing how the land use is developed around the transit system. Our built form, again, a little unique. The city itself is how many folks here are familiar with amalgamation? Okay, about half of you. So I guess back in the 90s, there was a great idea that we're going to take 6 municipalities, and I guess there was a metro government, which was sort of a regional government, sort of the equivalent of Region of Peel, and they decided they were going to take these 6 municipalities and make them the city of Toronto. So with that came a whole lot of sort of growing pains in terms of adapting different cultures, but as you can see, that was sort of the general makeup of the city. And I jokingly say, when I try to draw an analogy to my friends in the States, I say, think of Berkeley surrounded by Texas. And that's sort of in many ways sort of the politics of the situation at times. A little bit in between where you have some sort of modern people that tend to help out tilting things in the right direction. The urban form, again, a lot of the urban form, while urban in the downtown core, there is sort of a lot of post-war suburban development, large arterials, towers in the park, that sort of development that occurs on much of the periphery. Our strategic agenda. So when I came on board about 2 years ago, the one thing I did notice, we had a very good organization. They had gone through some downsizing, I guess during the budget cuts of about 2008, 9, and 10. But the one thing that they did a lot of good day-to-day operations, but there wasn't much of a direction to the organization in terms of what they were doing. They were good at doing things like internal process improvement, but they didn't really have a vision of what they wanted to be when they grew up. So I really wanted to sort of put together something that directed us more at the customer and what we're trying to do for the public. So we did a strategic agenda, and there's actually 5 areas. The 5th one is operations, but the public focus areas that we really wanted to focus on were some fundamental things of transportation. First, safety, mobility, livable streets, and quality infrastructure. And I think these are sort of the foundation that we tend to organize our entire organization around. Regarding safety in the city, this is roughly 1992 through about 2013. This is the number of traffic-related fatalities. You can see we were up in the 90s and 80s and 70s during the 90s, and we've really seen it trending down. The black line is total fatalities. The red is pedestrian. The yellow is auto only. Green is motorcycle, and blue is cycling. And you can see the trend is heading in the right direction. Last year, we did not have a good year with pedestrian fatalities. There was about 40 in the city, which is pretty high historically for the city of Toronto, but comparatively with most other major North American cities, is still pretty darn low. The one thing you'll notice is that the auto-only fatalities have really come down, and this year we expect, I think we're running about 5 this year to date. And I'll attribute much of that to in-vehicle technology. We're not necessarily seeing less collisions, but when they occur, we're seeing less injury from it for auto occupants. Now that said, the more vulnerable users, the pedestrians and the cyclists, I think we just actually had a fatality last year. We've always been about 3 or 4 a year. And again, when you look in comparison to sort of the number of cyclists we have in the city of Toronto, pretty good. Again, 3 or 4 fatalities is something I think we always want to improve on, but the big one right now is we're looking at is pedestrians. And again, to date this year, we're running at about 19. So that's with about 2.5 months to go. They tend to be our worst 2 months because as the sun comes up later and it goes down earlier, we tend to see sort of a spike of about 40 to 60% of pedestrian collisions during the months of October and November. Livable streets in Toronto. So we just embarked on a project with city planning called Complete Streets. It's pretty much a term that's used pretty widely at this point. But I think some of the challenges that we face, we have a lot of great products in Toronto, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But the challenge we always face is who gets priority. And we have, particularly in the downtown core, we don't have a lot of right-of-way. Much of the building face-to-face is about 20 meters, and historically has been carved off into about 3 meters for sidewalk, 3 meter parking/travel lane, 3 meters for streetcar. And so that's the cross-section that we have. We're not going to be blowing buildings out, we're not going to be widening too much, and we have a whole host of competing and new demands that are being placed in that same right-of-way. So for sort of just a standard 2-lane street and a sidewalk, we're talking we need 15 meters of right-of-way. If you want sort of a 4-lane street that can be used for parking and travel, again, this is our standard downtown core, many of our streets, King, Queen, Dundas College, they tend to have this sort of cross-section to them. If we want to start putting in an additional parking lane, we're up to 27, cycling lanes 30, patios up to 38, and sort of food carts and other fun things that you want to put in the right away, 45 meters. We don't have a lot of places where we have 45 meters. And we're not really building a lot of new, the city's pretty much built out, we're not building a lot of new streets, but we have all these demands on our streets. And we can't simply widen our streets, nor can we sort of squish everything together. So we have to figure out more innovative ways of doing things. So what Complete Streets in many ways is about how we allocate space and how we use space. And more that's becoming about temporal uses, time of year uses, things like that, so that a lane is not always a parking lane, perhaps a sidewalk is not always a sidewalk, a snow storage area is not always a snow storage area, and it's thinking about how we can design streets to be a little bit more flexible. Again, all the demands on the sort of public right-of-way. Some of these things you probably don't think about too much. Utility vaults, valet zones, lay-by lanes, vendors, newspaper boxes, green infrastructure that we want to see more and more of, parking meters, cafes, sandwich boards, gas meters that stick out. We have to figure out how to fit all these in there and make the right-of-way usable. So again, Toronto, there's no shortage of products we have. We have wet weather flow, streetscape manual, a bike plan, senior strategy, an active city strategy, a walking strategy. But what we've ran into is we have policies that say all these things that often conflict when we actually have to build things in the public and when we actually do projects. So much of our Complete Streets is going to be about figuring out who gets priority when and where. So that's going to be a little bit of the conversation. It's going to be a challenging conversation. We have different folks who think that their thing is most important, and we have to figure out a way to fit it all in within our system. There's a lot of great products out there already that have sort of addressed many of these Complete Streets issues. And I'll highlight some of the urban design manuals. But historically, in Canada, what has driven the design of our streets has been the Geometric Design Guide for Canadian Roads. And it's a product that I'll say is much like the Green Book in the US, very much suburban oriented, very much vehicular focused. And what we're trying to do is sort of revisit that. And so there's some good products out there. An organization that we're now part of called the National Association of City Transportation Officials. It was started in the US, but it was about a bunch of cities who got together and said, hey, you DOTs and AASHTO and TAC, your standards don't work for our urban places. We want to really revisit how we design them. So they basically took it upon themselves to develop their own design guidebook, which is now serving as sort of the blueprint for how we're redesigning our streets in Toronto. And we're doing a pretty good job at this. Everyone likes to sort of say, why can't we do the cool thing that Portland's doing, or Minneapolis is doing, or LA is doing? We are doing this. Unfortunately, well, fortunately for Toronto, is we're actually under a lot of construction right now. So we do have an opportunity to reconstruct things. I think at times it's not necessarily, folks look at the new and sexy and don't necessarily appreciate the good things that we've been doing. But this is Queens Quay, which is about to open, hopefully before Pan Am. But they've restarted, they've launched the streetcars on them last week. And when it's built, you can see this used to be sort of a wide road, and they reallocated it, transit way, bike path, sidewalk, and then left this for auto traffic and auto use. Market Street was sort of a partnership we did with a developer who was coming in on sort of the west side of Market Street. This is St. Lawrence Market, if any of you have been to Toronto. This basically served in many ways like a loading alley. But a new developer came in and he said, hey, I really want to remake this street. So we partnered with them. They put some money on the table. We put some money on the table. And we redesigned this. Which, I'm not sure I have the graph here. Oh, so what you don't see here is that during the summer months, the bollards go in and you basically have cafe seating outdoors. And then during the winter months, these bollards, this strip of bollards comes out. And this becomes a parking snow storage area and the sidewalk reverts to there. So it's the idea of sort of taking something that is always sort of fixed when you had curbs and trying to turn it into something that's a little bit more flexible. And what you notice here is that it's actually our first curbless street. So there's sort of a trench drain right through here that basically collects water in the street. Mobility in Toronto. Lots of headlines on this, lots of big numbers being thrown out about problems. I'll say not all of it is under transportation services purview, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So, you know, when we talk about transportation and travel, there's a whole sort of toolbox of things we can do. We can look at increasing supply, reducing demand, improving efficiency. But But what you'll find out is that in government, there's a whole host of different parties that are involved in various aspects. The biggest one is we don't oversee transit. There's a transit TTC oversees that. There's city planning, who oversees sort of the land use aspects of it, and is now taking a little bit more of a controlling role in developing transit plans within the city. There's transportation services, but then there's a lot of things like parking enforcement. And there's partners such as the province who basically influence much of this as well. So again, expanding road capacity is not really an option in Toronto. It's not something we're looking at. We don't have the space for it. We're not going to be ripping down rows of houses or buildings to sort of widen streets. I think the city, if we can manage the auto demand a little bit better, can handle some additional capacity or handle additional demands on the street without necessarily increasing the capacity. We can expand transit capacity. Again, this is one TTC, Metrolinx, and city planning are sort of partners in. Not necessarily directly under our control here. A long-term strategy, but probably something that you're not going to see short-term congestion relief for probably 10, 15, 20 years. And again, the other piece is it will likely be in sort of focused on key corridors. We can improve accessibility. That's again a city planning thing about looking to intensify development around areas where we can increase density with existing infrastructure without having to create new infrastructure. We can look at policies such as reducing SOV trips. So this may be pricing, it may be HOV lanes. There's a whole toolbox, but as you can see, there's a whole host of partners involved as well. Often they have common agendas, often we have different agendas. So it's about sort of working in government and making those policies work. Better coordinated signals, that's ours. So we are doing, so I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing on that front. Doing things like adaptive systems, which are smart traffic signals that can actually measure traffic flow and reallocate green time within an intersection to manage vehicular demands. Surface transit strategies. We have things like transit, we have transit signal priority in the city right now, but we're looking at new ways to actually use it to help TTC better manage their vehicle spacing. Active traffic management, something we, transportation services, did well in the freeway system, but we didn't necessarily do in the arterial system. Incident management, again, police services and transportation services, coordinating closures. Anyone who's been in Toronto knows how much construction is going on. At times it seems like they're just closing a lane this day, next day it's closed over here. You get down this street now and it's closed over there. It actually is thought through, doesn't always appear it, but it's thought through. There's just a lot going on. And so we're trying to manage that as best we can. Event management, again, there's special events in the city that bump into things as well. And then just managing bad behavior, people illegally parking or stopping or behaving badly. So again, we have a whole suite of toolboxes here. Doesn't all necessarily fall under our control, but we do work with most of these folks on these various aspects. I'm going to talk a little bit, why does it seem harder in Toronto? Everyone says everyone else is doing a great job. New York's doing this, and Philly's doing that, Chicago's doing this. First, I think you really have to look at the built form in many ways. And this here, again, is the downtown of Toronto. So this is approximately, I think, about 5 kilometers by about 3 kilometers. And what you don't notice, this is Philadelphia at the same scale. But what does anyone notice about those two images?
Density.
The scale's a little bit different. And so there's Toronto. There's Philadelphia, again, at the same scale. But the grids are just a different size. There's Chicago. There's New York City. So these are all at the same scale. And I think what's challenging about this is that when you look at this, Toronto's challenged in the sense that we sort of have a snapshot of the downtown area right there, which has a fairly dense grid, but most of Toronto is on about a 1 or 2 kilometer grid. So we don't have the sort of resiliency in our network that other cities often do. So in Philadelphia, if you take this lane out, within a mile here, you probably have 4 or 5 other streets to choose. In Toronto, you might only have 1 other street. So when we lose a lane or lose a street, it's that much more impactful. So, and this goes everything from transit operations to emergency response to construction to taking parking out, adding a bike lane. All these things, I think, have Toronto at sort of a slight disadvantage because we don't have that same level of resiliency within our network. So again, this is about 1 kilometer, and this is New York City. So they have block spacing, I think it's on the order of like 80 meters north and south. Whereas Toronto, you're looking at 80 meters, yeah, so roughly 0.1 kilometers. In Toronto, you're looking at a grid, except for Richmond and Adelaide right here, It's more at about 0.5 kilometers in downtown core, or a kilometer. This is sort of Philly laid on top of Toronto. Mode share, things have been shifting slightly. So you can see increase in cycling from 1.1 in 2006 to about 1.9 now. Slight drop in auto as mode share commuting into Toronto by about 3 percentage points. Increase in transit by about 2 percentage points. And again, walking is pretty even at about 7. This here is a map of cycling mode share. And I think it highlights the bars are graded by about 1% mode share. So this here is the 2006 mode share, and you can see the highest area was Ward 19 with about 7.5. Right now, it's about 11.3 in Ward 19 mode share. And I had another graphic, I didn't include it here, but what you'll find out is that most cities sort of went through the same evolution, particularly in terms of bike networks. We put bike lanes where they fit, not necessarily where the demand was. And actually, what we didn't have is we did not have good service into north or south or east or west into Ward 19. So we've recently put in Shaw Street, and we've recently put in Richmond and Adelaide, which sort of puncture right into the center of Ward 19. Again, not necessarily a great job of serving the area of highest demand. So we have these wards out here, 6%, 7%, 11%, and about 9%, right in the downtown core. And we have bike lanes that get you, in many cases, to the core, but not once you're in the core, you're sort of on your own anyway. So we're building it out. We're getting a little bit better. Again, so this is a fine print here, but they say, here's trend in shares of workers commuting by bicycles in large North American cities. Portland, I'm not sure I'd call Portland a large city. Great numbers there, but I'm not necessarily sure comparing Toronto and Portland's fair. Minneapolis, Vancouver, San Francisco, Montreal, Washington, Toronto. Now, this I think is sort of what I would consider peer cities, Chicago, New York. New York finally broke 1% mode share about a year ago for cycling. They're sort of touted as a very cycle-friendly city. Toronto's been running about 1.7, now we're about 1.92%. So I'll say even without a lot of infrastructure being put in, we tend to have a good cycling culture. This is just sort of a comparison with the top 10 cities in the U.S. Philadelphia, where I came from, was running about 2.2 back in the day. So Toronto would be just outside of the top 10 of the largest 70 North American cities. And in comparison to the true 10 largest cities in the U.S., Toronto would basically be right up there in the lead for large cities. Cycling safety, we've been doing a decent job on it. We're having a slight uptick over the past few years, but you can see it's been fairly stagnant. Now this is all, again, I think it was about 1.6, 1.7 here, and then this is about 1.9. So the cycling collision rate has actually been fairly stagnant when we look at the numbers. And sort of, again, in our downtown core, we've been slowly building things out. So that was 1993, 1994, that was 96. Sherbourne was 1998, the original bike lanes. That was 2000. You can see sort of little fits and starts here. Shooter went in 2002. Dundas went in 2003. And then there was sort of a few quiet years here. 2008, Wellesley was 2008. And then Sherbourne Cycle Track, 4 years later, was the first thing that really went in. Shoal Street over there, Wellesley Cycle Track's going in, and then this is what's being built right now on Richmond and Adelaide. And again, punctures over into Shaw Street, which is a major north-south connection. This here is the neighborhood that has roughly about 12 to 13% cycling mode share. Very close to the downtown, and it's about 4 or 5 kilometers to get to work for most folks. Under Mayor Ford, there was a big push to expand the trail network. So that is ongoing work, but this is sort of the existing multi-use trail that exists within the city. Fairly good, not necessarily good from a community standpoint. They tend to have more, most of the users for the trails tend to be recreational users. But I think it's a good thing in the sense that in many parts of the city where we don't have high cycling commuters, we actually do have high recreational use. And I think the important part of that is that it builds a good cycling culture for the city. And it gets folks who live out in areas that perhaps don't cycle to work every day relating to folks who actually cycle to work every day. So it's not that cyclist, but it's sort of something that I do, and I can relate to some of the challenges that they face because I too cycle. So from that standpoint, I think it's important for the city to sort of have a good culture about and sort of a wide geographic spread of users as well. We've started playing with GIS data, so this is where, okay, let's start nerding out on some of this stuff here. This is called Cycle Tracks. I think there's a product called Strava as well, which sort of does something similar. We got this from our good friends in the city of San Francisco, who basically just developed their own app with GPS tracking, and it basically drops breadcrumbs along the way. They gave it to us, we adapted it, we did some modifications. We put some information in there that we thought would be a little bit friendly to the user as well. We asked them about what's the purpose of your trip. So it's capturing time of day, path that people use. And we literally, at this point, I think we have 50,000 records in about a 4-month period. So it's actually very good. We're about to kick off a new bike plan. So this is going to be very helpful. And I think in many cases what we'll also do is, as I was saying here, this is sort of Richmond and Adelaide where we recently installed new cycle tracks. When they go in, we'll be able to see, did we actually get mode shift off of streetcars like King and Queen? And what happened? Did it actually modify behavior? Which I think will be very telling. But this here sort of gives you some sense of the cycling demand. Again, it's users that actively log in, but at least it's better than what we have right now, which is nothing. So it's a starting point for us. Congestion in Toronto, this is Bay Street. Everyone says it's so bad, it's getting worse. Well, it's always been bad. And this here is, I think, in the 1920s. Likewise, you can see, this is an issue that's always been around. Streetcar bunching, it existed back then as well. Here is Bay Street. But the point is that I think that there's a media perception about things getting worse. We are seeing things getting a little worse. I will not say we're not seeing sort of huge changes in congestion. This is sort of some information we gathered regarding demand and estimating the changes in demand. So the light blue is 2001. They're sort of volume levels we saw coming into the downtown core. The darker blue, the top curve, is 2011. So you're seeing an increase in the intensity and duration of congestion. So that is something we're seeing. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think things like spreading the peak are a good thing. We do want to sort of manage congestion, and the challenge right now we're facing is doing so with a lot of construction. So I like data myself, so I've actually been playing with a lot of things from INREX. So they're a source out there, they're a GPS tracker. Literally, I don't know what the gigabytes of data. I mean, they basically collect a lot of auto movements, put them on roadway networks. They actually monitor congestion for the GTA. So this is sort of their mapping of congestion. And what you're basically seeing is when you smooth it out for sort of seasonal fluctuations, it's not really getting that worse. This here is for the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So we're actually getting the data cut now for the city of Toronto itself, just to see what's happening within the city of Toronto. But the point here is that there's a lot of media hype about congestion, but a lot of it's anecdotal. A lot of it is sort of, everyone I think has that bad experience day, probably once a month, where things, you don't get home when you expect to. And I think that is the frustrating part. And I think that's really where we want to focus on improving reliability in the transportation system. This is a marketing, I'm from Philly, so I can bust on Philly. Marketing campaign from Philly during the 50s. Not necessarily the best marketing, I guess, but anyway, I slapped this up and I said, to Torontonians, as an outsider, I'm very familiar with what other cities are doing, and Toronto isn't as bad as Toronto often says it is. So there's a lot of good things going on here. Again, how do we stack up in terms of congestion? Everyone says it's the worst in the country. No, not even close to being the worst in North America, to be honest with you. We have Toronto here, Vancouver, Montreal. Again, objective third-party data that's being developed. And sort of what are the contributors to congestion within the cities? So we're seeing continued population growth, basically about 30,000 new people coming into the city every year. We're starting to see sort of job growth again occurring, particularly in the downtown core. This is high-rise construction. A little difficult to see, but as of 2013, we had 184 skyscrapers under construction, or high-rises, I think they call them. It's come down a little bit, but we still have a lot large intensity construction going on. Again, another graphic relating to that. We're doing a lot of construction, so we're seeing a lot of sort of permits for construction, protection being issued going up in the city. And I'll take a little break here and diverge slightly, but this here's a map showing the build out of the roadway system in the city of Toronto. Yellow is roads that were built pre-1901. Now, many of them have been reconstructed since then. Orange is 1901 1915. Red is 15 to 30. Blue is 30 to 45. So dark blue, light green, and dark green are all sort of post-war construction. And you can sort of see how, there's your downtown core, and then, I can't point out that high, but you have this sort of post-war construction. Again, a lot of more suburban development patterns than what we're used to seeing. But I think the one big piece of this is that when you look at the numbers, this is the lane kilometers constructed by year. So this is about 1940 here. After the war, Toronto went through a building boom, and again, this is the amalgamated Toronto, and it sort of tapered off toward the end. And the key point I want to make here is that if you look at this and say, most pavements will last roughly 50, 60, maybe 70 years. What this is showing is that this here is 50, 60, and 70 years, and what you're seeing is that a lot of these roads are actually reaching the end of their useful life. So what we're also having in the city is sort of a bit of an infrastructure issue. We had a whole host of years here where we didn't build a lot of new stuff. So we sort of had a free ride in terms of paying capital for roads. We didn't really have to maintain it because a lot of it was in pretty good shape. Right now we're sort of hitting a little storm here where maintenance costs are going up, the roads are deteriorating, and then also layer on top of it, capital costs of having to reconstruct it are also occurring. So this is putting a lot of pressure on the city as well. Plus, coupled with that, you guys have it here now as well, sort of a political rhetoric of no new taxes. We're not going to raise taxes. So we sort of have an infrastructure crisis that is coming at us in the city of Toronto, and we really have to figure out a way to do it and convince people it's worth paying for it. Now with that comes a lot of good investment in public sector projects. We have currently 4,300 active projects throughout the city. This is me. This was an advertisement that they ran in the Star. But apparently there's a lot of backlash about construction in the city right now. But I also tell folks, back in the old days, they used to just shut everything down and rip it up. So we can't do that anymore. We're expected to maintain traffic. We're expected to keep the city running. We're expected to not impact TTC vehicles. And this is sort of the construction that went on. People just sort of walked across construction sites back in the day. We're not really afforded that luxury anymore. So we have to be a little smarter. We're doing a lot of utility works. These are all the permitted projects that are currently actively permitted in the city. So as you can see, transportation, water, TTC, utility projects as well. And also we have a lot of street events in the city. So we're trying to manage all this as well. It's complicated. It's very dynamic. And it makes my days go fast, that's for sure. I sort of say there's three sorts of types of congestion in the city. We sort of see congestion in the downtown cores. So this here is downtown Toronto. That's North York, which is also sort of seeing a lot of congestion up around the 401. We also see a lot on the freeway system. In many cases, what happens on the freeway system spills back on the local roads, and many times what happens in the local roads spills back on the freeways. And we also have sort of all of our arterials. And so these are becoming the routes of last resort, but they're also starting to, many of them to reach capacity. So we put together a plan about a year ago to sort of put a case together for making additional investments. We have some additional challenges. Again, in the downtown core, we have sort of this 4-lane cross-section that exists, where there's parking off hours. And we also have streetcars, which, better or for worse, we have to deal with them. But they do, they operationally make some challenges for us within the city. And we also have issues where any turning vehicles often block streetcar routes or streetcar vehicles because the streetcars themselves are actually located in left-hand lanes. So we put together a plan, and one of the key things we did out of the gate, and this is sort of the low-cost stuff we haven't been doing a while, is simply retime some of our corridors. And so we did these basically in 2012, 2012, 2013 corridors. And just to sort of show folks the value of redoing some of this, we actually did some analysis on before and after, value of time, delay savings, and things like that. The value of time benefits on these corridors, you can see the numbers right here. The investment is roughly $4,000 per traffic signal. So for a cart of 20 signals, you might only be talking $100,000 investment. And over the course of a year, you're saving that much delay for folks. The benefit, the cost for a government investment is sort of off the charts, so this was sort of a no-brainer. But there's also sort of the other piece of reducing delay, emissions, and fuel consumption as well. This is sort of the planner's, engineer's dilemma here is, in many ways, sort of reducing congestion. You may actually encourage more people to drive, but at the same time, you're looking roughly here at about 2 million liters of fuel saved each year. And these emission reductions that we have here were the equivalent of about 10 Hyde Parks in the city of Toronto. So it was about, I think it was about 4,000 acres of forest would have the same emission reduction as tying these 3 corridors right here. So we're looking at some real significant benefits on this. We did a few more last year, again, sort of the same types of benefits we're seeing. This hadn't been done in a long time, so it was very valuable. And so now we're going to be expanding that program over the next 2 years to kind of add more corridors to it. And again, I think what a lot of people forget is that most of these routes as well, TTC is running bus operations on them. So there are benefits. The corridors we are picking, we are aligning them with TTC benefits. So that's just sort of, while it's oriented toward vehicles, there's TTC users that actually benefit from this as well. I'll skip all these, but we're taking a whole host of steps in terms of trying to better combat congestion in the city. And I'll flip this around to everybody so we can give you a copy of the presentation if folks want to see it. But one thing we did is we recently upgraded our traffic operations center. It used to be the traffic management center, now it's the transportation operations center. And the goal here is we really want to modernize what we're doing. And as I mentioned, we had a big focus on managing our freeways really well. So we had cameras on all our freeways, and the traffic management center actually only monitored the freeway system. We're actually now going to deploy that and start monitoring the arterials so that we can look at things like enforcement, better timing traffic signals, having better situational awareness of what's going on out there. So over the next 3 years, we're going to be actually deploying a whole host of cameras throughout the city. We're going to have better situational awareness for the city. So this is sort of what they look like, but again, it gives us some eyes on the city. We're getting into things about getting better traveler information out there. We hadn't done a lot of this, so this is sort of a simple thing that other cities have been doing. We deployed it in about 6 months, but you'll see this on the BVP, and it gives you sort of the time to various locations throughout. We're tweeting. This was mind-blowing for our engineers. They were tweeting. Now, I wouldn't recommend subscribing to this. There's only 376 followers for a reason, because there's probably a new tweet about every 20 minutes about something that, unless you're in the Gardner or the Lakeshore, you really don't care about. But the media outlets follow this. So this is basically our conduit to getting real-time information out to the media as quickly as possible. So we have one that's oriented toward the Gardner and Lakeshore, we have one for the Down Valley Parkway, and we now started deploying one on the major, we call it major roads. And when we get new software systems for our traffic operations center, we're going to have basically a subscription-based service where you can actually pick different roads by different times of the day, and any alerts that come in that impact those roads, you'll get sort of customized emails. So this is all about just getting better information out there and better communicating to the public on what's going on. Other key things are going on, almost done here, data collection. This may be of interest to you guys. We're working with TTC to actually look at ways to improve their surface transit operations, so we're revisiting the whole transit signal priority policy. And we're also doing something as simple as the peak hours in the city of Toronto had peak hour clearances on many of those 4-lane roads that were every day, 7 to 9, 4 to 6, everywhere throughout the city. Problem is, rush hour is no longer 7 to 9 or 4 to 6. So what happened is at 6 o'clock on many of the TTC routes, one car would pull in to stop to go get dinner. And all of a sudden, we lost about 50% of the capacity for the route. So we're actually now taking data, and our good friends here are going to help us out on this. We're taking data, and we're actually going to be using data to help determine what are the peak hours on various routes. And we're going to be modifying our peak hour clearance times to reflect the reality of what's out there now. I think this is sort of like the simplest, low-cost, no-brainer thing we can do. We haven't had good data. Collecting all the data has been challenging. But now with GPS data, it's actually becoming much easier to do. Travel information, another key part where we haven't been terribly progressive on. So tweeting is our first step. But again, if we can get customized travel information out to people, I think that would be hugely invaluable. Did anyone here take GoTrain? There's something called, okay, Go. Well, they have I think it's called Go Alerts or something like that, where you can actually subscribe. It's the same sort of model that we want to do for roadways, but you can actually tell them which route you're going, which direction you're going, and which hours you want alerts for. So if you're coming, say, Lakeshore eastbound, you can say Lakeshore eastbound, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Anything that happens on Lakeshore eastbound, they give you a customized personal alert. So that's sort of the model we want to go to. Again, Google Maps. This is sort of the perfect, this is sort of fed by the sort of big data that's out there right now. This is the sort of thing that can help us figure out quickly and cheaply, not necessarily perfect, but quickly or cheaply, how the system's performing. So I imagine everyone in this room, we did a survey on this. How many folks sort of use this stuff for decision making? We have one, okay. We asked a survey question. We talked about transportation services, about how do you get your traveler information. And it was sort of fairly predictable. It was like 60 and above, it was like radio, TV. And once you got to sort of 35 and below, 50% of the data on traveler information came via Google Maps or the equivalent. So it's just funny how people take data in, and we really have to change how we provide information. We still want to tap into that 45 to 60-year-old demographic by pushing data out to the 680 radio stations, those CBC, those things. But more and more folks are going to be looking for customized travel information. So that's what's going on. For those of you who are sort of interested in this stuff, we are actually doing a lot of hiring. We're sort of revamping our organization, and we're doing some hiring, and I'm not sure if there's any engineers in here, but we're going to be pulling some data people in soon. So we're going to actually be creating some folk, sort of a data unit internally, and so any folks that are interested in this, sort of keep your ears open. I'll tend to, anytime we post things, I'll send them through some of your faculty here, but we want to sort of get the best and brightest working within the city at this point. So that's my spiel, and I'm more than willing to answer questions, comments, suggestions. Thanks for having me.